At midnight, 6 black canoes slid into the freezing Atlantic, straight toward Hitler's fleet. No engines, no lights, just paddles and silence. The sea off the French coast was black as ink, the kind that swallowed sound. Only the faint glow of phosphorescence marked where paddles dipped and rose. The men moved like shadows, their breath fogging in the December air. Behind them, the dark hump of HMS Tuna began to sink, its steel hull disappearing beneath the waves. When the last trace was gone, the ocean became vast and empty. Major Herbert Blondie Hassler watched the submarine's hatch close, the clang echoing in his chest. "No turning back now," he murmured. The words weren't for his men, they were for himself. The 6 folding canoes, Cockle Mark II craft, 60 pounds each, were half submerged already, their fabric hulls slick with frost. The men worked quickly, snapping aluminum frames into place with numb fingers. The sea rolled beneath them, gentle but cold enough to burn. One wrong move, and a man could vanish in seconds. Corporal Bill Sparks, Hassler's second-in-command, cursed under his breath as a paddle slipped from his grasp. Christ! He lunged for it, nearly tipping the boat. Hassler grabbed his shoulder, steadying him. "Easy," he said. "You drop it, you die." A wave broke over the nearest canoe, flooding its cockpit. 2 Marines bailed with their helmets, their breath ragged. The others watched in silence. Every minute spent on the surface increased the risk of being spotted by German patrols. Far to the east, over the Bay of Biscay, the faint glow of a lighthouse swept across the horizon, a German-controlled beacon. Hassler looked at his men, 12 faces under black wool caps, eyes hollow but burning. They'd trained for months in secret, in freezing Scottish waters, preparing for this. Operation Frankton, a mission so unlikely even the Admiralty had called it madness in canoes. Their orders were simple and suicidal. Infiltrate the port of Bordeaux, over 70 miles upriver, and plant limpet mines on German cargo ships supplying the U-boat fleet. No one expected them to return. When Tuna slipped beneath the surface, a strange quiet settled over the men. The rhythmic hiss of the sea replaced the hum of the submarine's engines. The sound of the world itself became enormous, the slap of waves, the whisper of wind over canvas. They paddled in pairs, forming a line, 6 dark commas on a page of water. Hassler led in catfish, Sparks behind him in crayfish. The others followed. Conger, cuttlefish, coalfish, cachalot. The names were small jokes, pieces of gallows humor. None of them laughed now. The first hour passed without incident. The moon slid behind clouds, leaving only the dim shimmer of foam to mark the swell. Each man kept his eyes fixed on the glow of the paddle ahead. Frost gathered on their sleeves. The salt air stung their faces raw. In Hassler's pocket, his logbook was already damp. He would later write, "We were alone now, 6 men and a river of death ahead." A sudden splash shattered the rhythm. The last canoe lurched. Someone had misjudged the swell. A curse, a cry, then a cold silence. Hassler twisted around. "Light," Sparks whispered. "No light," Hassler snapped. To use a lamp was to die? They waited, listening. The sound came again, frantic splashing. Then nothing. Only the heartbeat of the sea. 1 canoe gone. 2 men swallowed. The survivors said nothing. They adjusted their course and paddled harder, the muscles in their shoulders burning. Sparks glanced at his watch, 1:40. They'd been on the surface barely 90 minutes, and already the ocean had taken its first payment. By 3 a.m., a low mist rolled in from the bay. Visibility dropped to 50 yards. The canoes drew closer together, whispering through cupped hands to keep contact. Somewhere to the east lay the mouth of the Gironde River, their entry point into occupied France. But without landmarks, the world became a blur of gray and black. The tide began to turn. The Atlantic's pull fought them like an invisible hand, dragging them backward with every stroke. Hassler felt his arms turn to lead. "Keep your rhythm," he said softly. "The tide will change." At 4:15, they reached calmer water, the first swirl of the Gironde estuary. The smell changed. Less salt, more mud and decay. Somewhere inland, a dog barked. A German one, perhaps. The men stiffened. They drifted in the current, silent. The shore was invisible, but they could sense it, the faint reflection of trees, the murmur of distant machinery. The estuary was wide as the sea, but it had eyes. German patrol boats swept the waters, and watchtowers lined the banks. Hassler gave a hand signal, 2 fingers raised, then pointed forward. Time to move. Each canoe crept inland, the paddles dipping silently, barely breaking the surface. The water thickened, sluggish with silt. A dead branch floated by, brushing against Sparks's leg. He flinched as if it were a hand. Above them, faint searchlights combed the sky for RAF bombers. The beams flickered across the low clouds, painting the river in ghostly flashes. The men froze each time, their boats motionless, breath shallow. Then the light would pass, and they'd move again. At dawn, the first outline of the French coast appeared, a jagged black line against a pale gray sky. The men grounded their canoes in a patch of reeds, dragging them ashore with trembling arms. Hassler checked his map, the first leg complete. 50 miles remained. He turned to Sparks. 2 men gone, he said. Sparks nodded. 4 canoes left. Hassler looked upriver, where the fog still clung to the water like smoke. Beyond that lay Bordeaux and the German fleet. He wiped the salt from his eyes. Then we keep going. They hauled the canoes back into the current. The tide was rising, the pull of the river sharpening against them. And as they disappeared into the mist, the first gulls began to circle, drawn by something floating in the surf. One of the lost canoes, overturned, its hull cracked like an eggshell. No sign of the men inside. The mission had just begun and was already falling apart. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They called it the Gironda, a river wide as the sea and full of enemy eyes. By dawn, the canoes were specks of shadow moving against a tide that wanted them dead. The estuary stretched for miles, cold and colorless. Somewhere in the fog, German patrols waited, in launches, towers, and on the banks with rifles ready. But for now, there was only mist and silence, the steady dip of paddles slicing water cold enough to kill. Hassler's hands were numb inside his gloves. Keep low, he whispered. The men nodded, breath clouding the air. Behind him, Sparks matched his rhythm, quiet, deliberate, every stroke measured. They had already lost 1 canoe to the Atlantic. 11 men remained. The Gironda was treacherous. Tides twisted like knives, dragging them into eddies or grinding sandbanks. At dawn the fog thinned, revealing muddy banks and distant factory chimneys. France, occupied and hostile. From far away came the drone of trucks, the sharp bark of a dog. They rested at midday on a sandbar, hidden behind reeds. No fire, no talk, just cold rations and shaking hands. Marine McKinnon tried to move his fingers. They were white and stiff. Sparks passed him a scrap of blanket. You fight by not freezing, he said quietly. Hassler studied his chart, 12 miles covered. 60 to go? We'll make it, he murmured, not sure he believed it. When darkness fell, the men pushed off again. The current now turned against them, the river narrowing like a throat. The lights onshore grew brighter, German checkpoints, watch huts, perhaps the silhouettes of moored ships. Then came the low hum of an engine. Down, Hassler hissed. They flattened against their decks as a patrol launch cut through the water 30 yards away. A searchlight passed so close it lit the frost on Sparks's sleeve. Nobody breathed. Then it moved on. Minutes later, silence returned. But 1 canoe, Coalfish, began to drift behind, caught in an eddy. We've lost the rudder, a voice whispered through the mist. Keep going, Hassler ordered. We'll regroup at the bend. The bend never came. A muffled crash, a splash, then nothing. Only the tide. Hassler waited, counting seconds. Coalfish, report. No answer. Just the slow slap of water. Sparks whispered, they're gone. 4 canoes left. They paddled on through the dark. The sky cleared, stars appeared, reflected in the river like shards of glass. Occasionally, laughter drifted from the German side, a reminder of how close they were. The smell of diesel reached them, faint but sharp. We heard the world we came to destroy, Hassler would later write. Near midnight, they dragged their canoes into the marsh on the southern bank and collapsed beside them, soaked and shaking. The moon rose, pale and merciless. Sparks glanced upriver, toward the faint silhouettes of cranes and dockyards, the first signs of Bordeaux. Tomorrow, Hassler said, voice hoarse. We finish it. Somewhere behind them, something bumped against the shore, a scrap of wreckage, drifting downriver. By dawn, they were down to 4 canoes. And ahead, the German docks of Bordeaux. They had paddled for 80 kilometers. Hands numb, lips cracked from salt and cold. And still the whisper passed from boat to boat. Keep low. Just a few more miles. By the night of December 11th, the river had narrowed into a dark corridor of pilings, sandbanks, and moored silhouettes. Frost silvered the gunnels. The air smelled of tar, wet rope, and ferment from the wine warehouses upriver. Somewhere beyond the bend lay Bordeaux, cranes like iron trees, hulls pressed shoulder to shoulder, German flags hanging heavy and black. They moved in file, for canoes now, hugging the south bank where reeds stitched a thin shadow against the current. Searchlights probed the overcast sky for RAF, their beams stroking the clouds and falling back as pale ghosts on the water. Every time the lights swept near, the men flattened, breath locked tight in their throats. A freight train rumbled across a bridge ahead, shivering the night with a metallic hum. Sparks watched the windows flicker past, each glowing like a watchful eye. If anyone looked down, they would see only ripples. If anyone shouted, it would be over in seconds. No one shouted. The river swallowed the sound and gave nothing back. They slipped beneath the bridge. Drops of condensation fell from girders like cold rain. For a heartbeat, the iron roof drummed with the train's weight. A thunder directly overhead. And then they were through, back in the open dark. At 20:10 a.m., dull engine throbbed from starboard. A patrol launch edged from a cove, its bow wave knifing the reflections into shreds. Down, Hassler hissed, edging catfish into reeds. The beam of the launch's lamp scrolled across the water, slowing as if sniffing. It paused on a line of driftwood, carried on. The crew laughed at something, a joke drifting in German over the river. Then the launch nosed away. The light died. They paddled again, slower, counting strokes. Cold turned their arms to clubs. One boat, Cuttlefish, began to drag, her bow riding low. A seam had wept all afternoon. Now it let go. The men bailed in silence, cupping water by the helmetful, but the canvas sagged like a wounded lung. Hassler signaled to ground on a mud shelf. They lifted the bow by fingertip strength and pressed wax through the seam with shaking thumbs. It held for a minute, then bled again. "Scuttle," Hassler said softly. The 2 Marines looked at him as if the word were a verdict. He nodded once. They sank the canoe under the reeds, broke their paddles, and crawled inland with a compass, as trained, to attempt escape by land. In the official report, the line would be small, Cuttlefish unserviceable. Crew separated. On the river, the absence felt like a missing heartbeat. 3 canoes remained. 6 men. The banks drew closer, wharves jutting into the channel like teeth. Huge hulls loomed, freighters painted black from waterline to masthead, so they dissolved into the night. Names in white block letters showed for an instant as a searchlight slid past a quay. Tannenfels. Drachenfels. Sparks tasted metal in his mouth. "There they are," he breathed. They nosed into the lee of a barge and let the current drift them, measuring distances by sound. The rattle of chains, a distant cough, boots on planks, a guard's board whistle. Every noise meant a timing, a gap, a chance. Hassler checked his luminous watch. The hands were pale green commas. He tapped Sparks' sleeve and pointed to the canvas roll lashed under his knees, the limpets. Each mine weighed about 9 kilos, with a coil of rubber to quiet the steel and a time pencil clamped to its face. A little brass tube holding a glass ampoule. Crushed the ampoule, acid ate a wire, the spring snapped, and the striker bit the detonator when the clockwork decided it was time. Silent. Certain. They drifted past a warehouse, where German sentries smoked behind a stack of crates to shield their glow. The wind shifted and carried the smell of their cheap tobacco and a splash of laughter. Sparks felt an urge to cough and swallowed it back, so hard his throat burned. A tugboat pushed out without warning, stern wake heaving the canoes. Conger yawed, head swung broadside, and thumped a piling with a drum-like boom. Voices on the quay stopped. A lamp jerked awake and skimmed the water. Hassler's knuckles went white on his paddle. The beam climbed, searching faces, water, reeds, the dinghy pinned to the piling. A rat leapt from the timber and splashed. The guard swore at it, kicked the rope coil, and the lamp fell away. They held still for another minute, time measured by heartbeat. then slid into a shadow under a pier where ropes hung like kelp. Sparks unclipped one limpet and passed it forward, grease smearing his gloves. Hassler cradled the mine in both hands, testing the magnet faces against a bollard. The pull was savage. It wanted the metal more than his fingers. He smiled without humor. It'll hold. He sketched the plan in whispers. 2 boats would go in, catfish and crayfish. Conger would wait in the channel to help if something went wrong, then turn downriver as a decoy. Mines on as many hulls as they could reach. Tannenfels, Drachenfels, anything fat with fuel. Timers set so the blasts would stagger toward dawn, to create panic, to keep the Germans awake and running as damage multiplied. Then, the escape. Beach the canoes, split into pairs, turn for Spain on foot. None of that part was guaranteed. A train bell clanged somewhere inland. Midnight was close. They edged along pilings until the iron belly of a freighter roofed out the sky. The hull rose above them like a cliff, black paint sweating cold. Hassler reached up and felt the clammy steel, a wall of Germany under his palm. He pressed the first limpet flat. The magnets bit. The mine became part of the ship. Sparks leaned in, crushed the ampoule, and slipped the brass pencil into its clip. The tiny, cruel clock began to count. They moved to the next plate seam, working by touch, by breath, by the slow turn of luminous hands. Somewhere above, a bored sentry cleared his throat. Footsteps crossed a gangway. A bottle clinked. Sparks and Hassler froze, faces almost touching the hull, mouths open to hear the vibrations of those steps through iron. When the sound faded, Sparks realized he had left fingernail crescents in his own palms. Under the next quay, crayfish slid toward a second freighter. The water smelled sweeter here, wine leaking from casks. The taste mixed with diesel and made the back of the throat ache. A slow current tried to ease the canoe out from under the hull. The bowman hooked a mooring ring with 2 fingers and held them in the cold for a count of 10, then 20. The second set of magnets clacked home with a dull kiss. Another pencil crushed. Another clock began to chew through wire. Hassler checked the time again. Midnight. He looked across the ink of the basin and met Sparks's eyes. No words, just a nod. They split. 2 canoes ghosted into the docks. The third drifted back to the channel to watch the mouths of the piers, a single dark pupil in the river's eye. Above them, the Germans slept. And down in the water, 6 small clocks started ticking. The docks were silent. You could hear the ticking of the fuses and the sound of your own heartbeat. Midnight, December 11th, 1942. The port of Bordeaux lay asleep under frost and mist. Water lapped softly against black hulls, and the air smelled of oil, rope, and diesel. From the far quay came the shuffle of boots, the faint clink of a rifle strap, and then silence again. 2 canoes, catfish and crayfish, slid between the shadows. No lights, no words, only the whisper of paddles cutting through water cold as steel. Hassler raised his hand, and the canoes slowed. Ahead loomed the Tannenfels, 10,000 tons of German steel, her sides rising like a wall. Sparks unwrapped a mine, smooth metal, heavy and cold, and passed it forward. Hassler pressed his palm to the hull. It felt like touching a glacier. He fixed the magnets, and there was a soft click. They froze. Above them, footsteps crossed the deck. Voices, muffled laughter. A match flared, then died. The Germans smoked and talked, unaware of the shadow crouched beneath their ship. Another mine went on, then another, each one sealed with the small, decisive sound of a clock starting to count. Under the next pier, Corporal Laver and Marine Mills worked beneath the Drachenfels. Their canoe rocked in the current. Mills held his breath, pressed the limpet flat, click, and let go. A guard on deck turned at the noise, shone his lamp across the rail. The light skimmed the water, passed over their heads, and stopped. Mills felt his heart stop too. Then the guard muttered something about the anchor chain and turned away. By 1:30 a.m., 6 mines had been set under 5 ships: Tannenfels, Drachenfels, Portland, Ulster, and Dresden. 6 mechanical hearts ticking under the skin of the Reich. Hassler checked his luminous watch. Time to leave. The canoes drifted backward, paddles barely breaking the surface. Sparks risked a glance behind. The freighters were still, perfect in their sleep, reflections trembling in the dark water. The port seemed peaceful, absurdly peaceful, and that made it worse. They paddled until their arms went numb. Frost crusted on their sleeves. The air burned to breathe. After 10 hours in water barely above freezing, every heartbeat hurt. At last they pulled into the reeds along a side canal, letting the tide carry them into hiding. No one spoke. Sparks rubbed his hands together. The skin was white, cracked, almost bloodless. "Can't feel them," he whispered. "Good," Hassler said softly. "You'll feel less fear that way." They crouched low, watching the faint orange glow of Bordeaux through the fog. Somewhere out there, German guards walked their rounds. Somewhere below them, the fuses turned and turned. The men knew what 6 hours meant. At dawn, when the harbor came alive, the explosions would start, one ship after another, steel peeling open like fruit. But for now, nothing moved except the tide. When the current shifted, they let it take them. The river's pull grew stronger, dragging them away from the docks and toward the open estuary. The city lights faded behind them. Sparks broke the silence. "Think it'll work?" "It has to," Hassler said. "We didn't come this far to scare them." The words floated away into the dark. Ahead, the water widened, opening toward the sea. The faint smell of salt replaced the reek of oil. By dawn, the sky had turned a pale gray. The cranes of Bordeaux stood like black crosses against the light. Hassler looked back one last time. "It's done," he whispered. They vanished into the mist, for dark shapes drifting down the Gironde. Behind them, 6 tiny clocks ticking beneath the enemy's fleet, hidden hearts waiting for morning. They had disappeared into the night. And behind them, a ticking port. At dawn, the fishermen saw smoke rising over the port. The first explosion sounded like thunder, and then came 5 more. The still morning of December 12, 1942, shattered. The Tannenfels erupted first, a deep roar that rolled across the water and struck the city's windows like a hammer. Flames leapt through the fog, turning it red. Moments later, the Drachenfels tore open at the waterline, a sound like the sea splitting in two. Within minutes, chaos consumed Bordeaux. Sirens wailed. German guards ran along the quays, shouting orders no one could hear over the noise. Shells of ships burned at anchor, their metal frames twisting in the heat. Fuel poured into the river and caught fire, spreading a black slick that burned slow and steady. A French dockworker, crouched behind a warehouse, later told investigators, "We thought it was a submarine attack. The ships just exploded, one after another. But there were no planes, no torpedoes, nothing." The Bremen went next. Her bow lifted clear of the water before sinking nose first into the mud. Windows shattered for miles. Every German patrol boat launched at once, racing in circles through the smoke, guns sweeping across empty water. But there was no enemy to find. The attackers were already gone, hours away, drifting downriver, paddling for their lives. By the time the fires reached their full fury, Hassler and Sparks were ashore, hiding in a thicket near the riverbank. They couldn't see Bordeaux, but they could hear it, a distant rumble rolling through the earth. Sparks lifted his head. "That's them," he whispered. Hassler nodded once. "And that's our answer." For a few minutes, neither spoke. They knew what it meant. The mission had worked. And they also knew that most of their comrades would never live to hear that sound. North of them, the Germans sealed the city. Every roadblock, every bridge, every farmhouse searched. Patrols hunted the riverbanks for any sign of survivors. Within 3 days, 2 Marines were caught hiding near Blaye. After interrogation, they were executed at dawn. The others vanished, some drowned, some shot trying to cross fields. Official reports later confirmed it. 6 of the 10 commandos were captured and killed. Only Hassler and Sparks remained unaccounted for. In Bordeaux, the Gestapo interrogated dockworkers and fishermen. Nobody believed that 6 men in canoes could cripple a port guarded by 1,000 soldiers. Even Berlin refused to accept it. Goebbels called it enemy propaganda. But the wrecks told the truth. 5 ships destroyed, 7 damaged. The docks shut down for months. German logistics to the Atlantic submarines cut to half capacity. One admiral wrote bitterly, "Our ships burned, and no enemy was seen." That night, while Bordeaux still smoldered, Hassler and Sparks prepared to move south on foot. Their boots were soaked, their faces raw from salt and cold. They had no radio, no map, no food. Only a compass and a plan that ended at the Spanish border, 100 miles away. Sparks glanced back toward the horizon, where a dull orange glow still rose from the port. "Worth it?" he asked. Hassler didn't answer. He simply said, "We did what we came to do." The two men walked into the woods, disappearing into the fog. Behind them, Bordeaux burned. Only two men were still alive. And their way home, through occupied France. Lieutenant Hassler and Marine Sparks, last seen heading south by bicycle. That single line appeared in a prefect's report 3 days after the explosions. It sounded simple, like two men on a countryside errand, but it was the start of the hardest journey of their lives. They rode through the backroads of occupied France, frost biting their fingers, chains squealing in the cold. The bicycles were barely holding together, one tire patched with candle wax, the other missing a pedal. Every turn of the wheel took them deeper into enemy territory. German patrols moved along the main roads in convoys. Their boots and engines echoed across empty fields. The two men kept to hedgerows, slipping from one shadow to the next, moving when the wind covered their noise. Outside Saint-André-de-Cubzac, a farmer blocked their path. He was an old man with hands cracked like bark. He looked at them for a long moment, then held out a crust of bread and a dented cup of water. Hassler reached for money. The farmer shook his head, said nothing, and simply pointed south. It was the only direction that mattered. They pushed on. In the next village, a widow gave them a blanket and a piece of smoked pork. "Sleep in the barn," she whispered. "If the soldiers come, be still." They never looked twice. The barn smelled of hay and damp wood. Sparks fell asleep sitting up, the blanket frozen stiff around his shoulders. By the 5th night, they abandoned the bicycles. Too dangerous now, too loud. From then on, they walked. Through orchards, fields of black mud, empty vineyards shrouded in mist. Sometimes they crawled through ditches when headlights swept the road. Their boots tore apart, feet bleeding into their socks. When Sparks tried to speak, his teeth chattered too hard to form words. Near Libourne, they hid under a bridge as a German patrol crossed above. The soldiers joked, their laughter echoing through the stone arches. Sparks could smell their cigarettes, sweet, heavy, almost comforting. For a moment he thought, they're just boys, like us. Then he remembered the faces of the men who hadn't come back. The thought vanished. Rain turned to sleet. They drank from puddles and chewed on raw turnips stolen from a field. Hassler's compass froze. He thought it with his breath. Each night they traveled a few miles south, guided by the faint outline of the stars through cloud. One evening, they found refuge in a mill house. The owner, a quiet man with tobacco-stained fingers, hid them under sacks of grain while two German officers came to inspect his flour rations. The conversation above was polite, almost casual. When the officers left, the miller opened the trapdoor and handed Hassler a small loaf. "For England," he said softly. By the 10th day, the land began to rise. Hills replaced fields, and the wind carried the smell of pine and snow. They had reached the Pyrenees, the last barrier between France and Spain. A resistance contact, a woman with sharp eyes and a tired face, met them near Pau. She drew a crude map on cigarette paper, a shepherd's path, a mountain hut, a pass marked only by a line of black stones. "No talking," she warned. "No fires. And if you fall, keep falling south." She handed them 2 worn berets. "You'll look less like soldiers." They climbed at night. Snow squeaked underfoot, breath froze into mist. The moonlight made the world white and endless. Sparks's feet were raw, his legs trembling. "If we stop," he said, "we die warm." Hassler nodded. "Then we don't stop." On the 2nd day, a storm hit. Wind howled through the ravines, turning snow into knives. They stumbled into a shepherd's hut, a shell of stone and frozen straw. Inside, Hassler struck a match and lit a curl of paper. The tiny flame flickered like life itself. Sparks held his boots over it, steam rising from his socks like ghosts leaving a body. "We're almost there," Hassler said quietly. Neither of them believed it, but they kept moving. Crossing the summit took all night. There was no border post, no flag, just silence, a new quality of light. On the far slope, men in gray cloaks appeared, the Spanish Civil Guard. Their rifles glinted in the dawn. Hassler lifted his hands. Sparks followed. The guard spoke quickly, too fast to understand. Hassler pointed to his compass, to the British patch still sewn on his sleeve. After a pause, the sergeant spat in the snow and motioned downhill. It wasn't welcome, but it wasn't death either. Spain meant warmth, bread, and suspicion. They begged for food, traded their last coins for milk and shelter. In Burgos, a baker took pity on them. He led them to the back room, tore a loaf in half, and pressed it into their hands. "Ingleses?" he asked. Sparks nodded. The baker's smile was faint but real. "Then you are safe now," he said. Days blurred. They followed rail tracks toward Madrid, sleeping in culverts, ditches, and once inside a disused well. When they finally reached the city, they were too weak to walk upright. People stared but did not interfere. In wartime, everyone learned not to see. The British embassy stood behind a plain wooden door. Hassler knocked once, then again, his knuckles raw. When the door opened, warmth spilled out like sunlight. A man in a pressed suit looked them over, two scarecrows with frost in their hair. "Good Lord," he murmured. "Come in." They were given tea, bread, blankets. The official asked for names, for a statement. Hassler spoke quietly, eyes hollow from exhaustion. When asked for his final report, he said only 2 words: "Mission successful." That telegram reached London in a single day. The Admiralty confirmed: 5 ships destroyed, 7 crippled, the port of Bordeaux out of action for months. It had taken 12 men and 6 canoes. 10 were gone. 2 had made it home. Later, the newspapers would call it Operation Frankton. Historians would measure it in tonnage lost and months of disruption. But for Hassler and Sparks, it was simpler. It was a river, a current that tried to kill them, a series of faces, silent farmers, millers, priests, who risked everything for strangers they'd never see again. Years later, Sparks would say, "We weren't heroes. We just finished what we started." Hassler would never contradict him. 6 men had set out against an empire. 2 walked home through snow and silence. And history would remember them not for what they destroyed, but for what they refused to give up.